So I'm going to start recording right now. Okay. So this webinar is part of our SIVA for Health Equity program, which we offer to build capacity of leaders and staff within community-based healthcare settings to identify and address health inequities at organization and community-wide levels. And our hashtag is SIVA for Equity, and you can also follow it on all the social medias above. So let's go ahead and get started and getting to know each other. We want to know who is here. So I'm going to ask 3 quick poll questions. The first one is, I would like to know in which region of the US your organization is located. Are you in the West, Midwest, South, Northeast, or Caribbean? I'm going to wait a few more seconds. Okay, I'm closing in 3, 2, 1. All right, so we have a pretty much almost 50-50 between the Northeast and the West, and we also have some people from the South and the Midwest. The next question is, what type of organization do you represent? Are you coming from a hospital, a community-based organization, a government at different levels, health clinic, or another? And if it's another one, let us know in the chat. All right, I'm gonna close in 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1, closing. All right, and we have a divided audience, which is great. We have most people from community-based organizations, followed by different government agencies. Other, I can see in the chat, I don't see the others in the chat. And we also have representatives from hospital medical group practices and health clinics of federal qualified healthcare centers. And the last question before we get started is, in which of these groups best describes your position within your organization? We want to know if you are in leadership and in management, if you're a clinical frontliner, a non-clinical frontliner, or other. And if you choose other, please let us know in the chat. Okay, 5 more seconds. All right, I'm gonna be closing in 3, 2, 1. All right, and again, we have a diverse group, which is great. We have 42% of you who are non-clinical frontliners. We have then mid-management, and then we have clinical frontline, leadership, and in between the others, we have from nonprofit university, we have Lutheran Community Services in Northwest, social worker, crime victim advocate, Office of the Community College, which is great. So very, very diverse. And it's so important because this topic really touches everybody. You might not know it, but I'm pretty sure you know a refugee in a way or another. So this definitely impacts you as well. So thank you for taking a few seconds to share with us. So today's objective, we want to make sure that by the end of today, you are able to differentiate between a refugee and asylum seeker and other immigrant populations. You're able to explain the US refugee settlement process a little bit and apply the provided considerations for health and service providers when working with refugee populations. Today's agenda, it's on the screen. Again, we're going to be talking about a little bit of who is a refugee, what the resettlement process is, other populations similar to refugees and their differences. We're going to use a case study from New Jersey as an example, and we're going to discuss the refugee experience and then end with tips and considerations for you as a provider when working with this population. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our speaker today, Ms. China Shayna Ward. She has worked in the refugee field since 2010. She brings experience in refugee policy, advocacy, and community engagement from her work in Washington, D.C. with Refugee Council USA and HIAS. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Shayna. To her current role as a refugee wellness coordinator at the International Rescue Committee's New Jersey Office for Refugees. In this role, Shayna runs programs including a community health promoter program and community adjustment support groups, and supports the programming of partner agencies focused on refugee wellness. So thank you so much for joining us today. And before I pass you the microphone, I'm gonna go ahead and launch the poll that you presented. So the last poll we have is, we wanna know if you have worked with a refugee or other humanitarian migrant before. Very often, sometimes, rarely, or as far as you know, never. Okay, we're gonna wait 5 more seconds. All right, I'm closing in 3, 2, getting a lot of last minute ones. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the majority has worked with refugees in either very rarely or very often. And we still have 23% that says that never, as far as they know, worked with a refugee or another humanitarian migrant. So with that, Shayna, the microphone is all yours.
Great, thank you so much, Joanna. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I want to thank you all for your interest in this topic. It's something that is extremely important and has always been important, but the political climate and the state of the world is constantly in flux, and refugees are unfortunately always a constant in the world. So for me, thank you so much for that introduction, Joanna. I work at the New Jersey Office for Refugees, which is an office of the International Rescue Committee, and my office plays a unique role in that we liaise between the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement and partner serving agencies throughout New Jersey to provide direct services to clients. So today I'm really excited to give you an overview of who's a refugee, who's an asylee, what are some of the other humanitarian migrant immigration categories that are eligible for services through Office of Refugee Resettlement funding, and what kinds of common experiences do they have that you want to be aware of when you're working with them. So not only so you can better serve them in whatever role you have, but so you know what other kinds of services they may or may not be eligible for when you are making referrals so that they can get other kinds of assistance. So there's some important distinctions that we'll talk about amongst the groups and what they're eligible for. I'm really excited that we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. I really want this to be a helpful experience for you, and the Refugee Resettlement Program is just one piece of the programming that allows people to live here with legal status and get support. So we're going to go through some of those ways. I only have 30 minutes to present, so I'm going to do some of it quickly, but it's my understanding you'll have the PowerPoint later, and there are some additional links and bits of information in there that you can take a look at. And I'm really looking forward to what kinds of questions you have, especially with what's going on with Afghanistan, the Biden administration coming in, and the changes that we anticipate seeing in the months and years to come. Next slide, please. So who is a refugee? There's actually a very specific definition of a refugee. A refugee is someone who, under international and US law, is outside of their country of origin with a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and or political opinion. Around the world, there's 26.4 million refugees. This is a recent statistic from the UN Refugee Agency. There would be 82.5 million refugees if you counted the internally displaced people who have the same fear but have not left their country of origin. 35 million of these people are children, just to give a sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about. Next slide, please. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is a formal government program that was founded in founded basically in 1975, but governed by the Refugee Act of 1980. That's the law, that's the basis for our resettlement system. And this is a means that brings refugees from overseas to live here permanently in the United States. It's available for only a small number of refugees who have the greatest need of protection around the world. So for example, fewer than 1% of those millions of refugees are ever actually resettled each year, some to the United States and some to other countries that have similar refugee admissions programs. Resettlement is one of 3 durable solutions for refugees. The ideal situation for a refugee is that it becomes safe for them to return home. Often that's not possible. So the next best solution is for them to integrate into the countries to which they fled. So maybe they're in a neighboring country. It would be great if they could stay there. That often is not possible. And the last solution is to be resettled to a third country, to the United States or to another country. And that's where that 1% number comes from. Fewer than 1% of refugees ever get resettled. And the need for resettlement is much higher than the number of slots provided around the world by countries who have a program like this. Any refugee who comes to the United States goes through a rigorous selection process with a lot of security vetting and medical screenings. And actually, it's the toughest way an individual can end up on US territory is through the refugee admissions program in terms of all the security and medical screenings that they have to go through. Next slide, please. This is a visual of what the resettlement process looks like for people who come through the US Refugee Admissions Program. It's very long and a little bit convoluted, as you can see. There's overseas interviews of the persecution claim by US personnel, medical checks, background checks. For most people, it takes years to go through all of these processes once they apply and eventually be resettled here in the United States. Next slide, please. So this program includes many services that help refugees start their lives here. People who come through the US Refugee Admissions Program have a suite of services that they receive upon arrival and pre-arrival. There's some cultural orientation that helps them understand US law, US rights, sometimes even like weather if they're going to a cold place and they're from a warm climate. There are 9 national nonprofits that have partner and affiliate agencies throughout the country that do the work of picking refugees up at the airport, take them to their home that they have previously set up for them, provide them a hot meal, help them with groceries, and help them with all of those initial services like enrolling in schools for their children, enrolling in Social Security, other public benefits, and then gear them up to get set up for additional kinds of services like English language training, employment placement and training. And in addition, all refugees are eligible for medical services. Next slide, please. So an important distinction between a refugee and asylee is that they fit the same definition of persecution. The difference is how they get here. So refugees are selected overseas, they go through this process and they come to the United States. Asylees are people who have made it to the United States, either through a different immigration visa, a visitor visa, or just showed up at the border and have said, I would like to seek asylum, I am not safe in my country. So for a while, people who are seeking asylum are considered asylum seekers until they are adjudicated by an immigration judge as meeting this definition and in need of protection, and then they get the asylee distinction. So once they have that asylee status, then they're eligible for a suite of services as well, very similar to the refugees that we discussed. So asylum seekers are not eligible for many of the same services that they would be if they become adjudicated as an asylee. However, in a lot of the services that you provide, all of these people have had potentially similar backgrounds with challenges, trauma, also kinds of resilience that we'll talk about all of that. So the experience is similar, but the outcome and status might be different for a lot of folks. Next slide, please. So the asylum process, we touched on, it's people who are in the United States already or are arriving at the border on their own means who are seeking protection. People who are granted asylum are protected from being sent back to their country, are able, like refugees, to live in the US permanently and eligible to receive certain benefits. For refugees and asylees, After 1 year of being here or having asylee status, they can apply to become legal permanent residents. And after 5 years, they are eligible to naturalize and become citizens. So at that point, once they become citizens, they are no longer subject to removal or could be deported. But until they have citizenship, like other people with immigration statuses, they could be removed if they commit a certain kind of crime, like a felony. We don't see that a lot. Next slide, please. So some additional humanitarian populations that I want to make sure everyone is aware of, because they also get access to these ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement Funded Services, are special immigrant visa recipients. And these are Iraqi and Afghan translators and interpreters and other folks who work directly with the US government and partners. So they're eligible for these visas. It's kind of a complicated process, and we've been welcoming SIVs for many years through this program. And now it's in the news a lot because there's a really great need for safety for some of these folks. Cuban Haitian entrants. These are people who don't come through the refugee program, but they're able to get status to be here legally in the United States. I'm less of an expert on the Cuban Haitian entrant program, but they're eligible for the same kinds of services. Unaccompanied minors and victims of trafficking. Next slide, please. So one thing that I want to make sure everyone knows, Joanna, one more slide, thanks, is that refugees and humanitarian migrants with these statuses have legal status to be in the United States and are eligible for services funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement from the date of arrival or the date they get their status for up to 5 years. In New Jersey, well, actually across the board also, refugees, the services also include some sort of medical insurance, at least for some time. In New Jersey, for example, refugees are eligible for Medicaid upon arrival, and they're eligible to continue to receive that assistance until they make too much money to be eligible like anyone else living in New Jersey. So here we have a case study of New Jersey. And I have this here because I'm working in New Jersey and I know a lot of you are in the Northeast, but this really shows the diversity of clients that we see that you might come across. The last fiscal year, our office served over 1,000 clients from over 50 countries. The top 10 nationalities are listed there. You can see Afghanistan is actually at the top of that list. Oh, sorry, not at the top, it's in alphabetical order. It's in the top 10. A lot of Cubans we serve. So really just to see how diverse it is. The top 6 languages are all very different from different parts of the world. And what we see is that the changes in trends really do flow with the political climate and with what's going on around the world. So we're likely to see an increase in special immigrant visa recipients coming to the United States this year from Afghanistan, and different kinds of surges of refugees who are coming. The Biden administration made commitments to increase access to asylum and to the refugee resettlement program. So we're really glad to see that after the former administration, which really limited the number of folks who could get protection in the United States. So we're likely to see increases in late 2021 and early 2022 as things change and as the infrastructure needed on the back end behind the scenes gears up again to be able to process more folks. Next slide, please. Oh, you're already there. So the ORR funded programs are provided by designated agencies, the ones that I mentioned before, that are partners of those 9 national agencies that do refugee resettlement work. There's also some others that are not doing that refugee reception, but are still contracted to provide these kinds of services with Office of Refugee Resettlement funding. So the big buckets of services that these folks are eligible for are refugee cash assistance. So that includes coming up with different plans to help support people's self-sufficiency, but also some cash to help them get going from the beginning. Refugee social services, this includes employability services, different adjustment services to help people meet their basic needs and also feel whole as a person and thrive. English language training as well. There's also services that support students in school, school-age children under 18. Next slide, please. Services to older refugees, so some specific supports to help folks who are more isolated, who are older, who have different kinds of needs. Health screenings and follow-up are also included in this program. And there's also various refugee health promotion programming that helps support clients' health and well-being through different programs. Because of the way the Refugee Act of 1980 is written, there's an inherent focus on employment through these programs, and sometimes that's at the detriment of other components of people's lives, because when people arrive, the most important thing per the way this all works is that people get a job and they can support themselves and they don't rely on any cash assistance. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, because it's important for people to be working and be self-sufficient, but also sometimes it takes folks a little bit longer to integrate into a completely new life and in a completely new country, especially if English is not a language that they already speak, or they come from a country that's really just so different from the United States. So there's always a lot of conversation around that, how to support refugees in the kinds of needs that they have, alongside this push for early self-sufficiency and employment. Among all of these things, these programs also help connect clients to other public benefits like SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance, and temporary assistance for needy families, and affordable housing, as well as other community programs and supports that might be in the community where they are. Okay, so that was a lot. There's much more that I could say, but we're going to leave it at that for now, because we only have 30 minutes for me to present. So my next question to you to be thinking about as we go through the next part of the presentation is, what does this mean for service providers? What does this mean for you when you come across folks? Yes.
Yes. I wanted to ask you a question before we move on to this other part. We have Rachel asking, are the services for children focused entirely on school support, or also mental health, trauma healing, etc.?
Excellent question. All of the above. So there are special programs geared towards supporting students enroll in school and integrate well into the school. And that looks different in different places. So for example, sometimes it's helping school districts train teachers to work with refugee students. Sometimes it's helping families actually enroll their children in school, but the needs of children are wrapped up into all of these, and there's a look at the families as a whole, and you can't have a parent working if they're worried about their kids' mental health, for example. So there's a push and room here for children's needs to be met as well, including health and mental health. That doesn't mean there's enough services and funding for all of this stuff, but it is definitely included, at least in theory.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking that.
Of course, I wanted to open it up for questions before we move forward to the next. We still have some time. So one of the questions people ask a lot when we talk about refugees is, yes, you talk about the early self-sufficiency when it comes to work, but can you also talk about the part when they're like put into ESL classes, basically as soon as they get here, and how important that is for them to actually get a job?
Right. So English is extremely important for integration in terms of getting a job, in terms of being able to communicate with your children's teachers. It's important for all aspects of life. I mean, imagine if we went somewhere and we didn't speak the language of the country, how would we be able to thrive? So there is a push for English language training early on, and that goes alongside the employment. So as soon as someone is entering into employment services, there's usually, depending on the actual program, there's usually a requirement for people to also be involved in English language training. Certainly some refugees come fluent in English and don't need it, or need like employment or job specific English language training, but English language training is available to everybody because it's so important.
Thank you. I wanted to allow to see if anybody has any more questions before we move on. And I don't see that. So please, oh, wait. Yes, we have here, Brenda is asking, you mentioned that the process to become a refugee in the US is very long. If the issues is persecution from race, sexuality, gender, politics, etc., that way could mean someone's life.
Yes. Sometimes it can, and that's one of the problems with the way this program is structured, is that it doesn't move fast and it doesn't allow people in like emergency situations. But also remember that the definition of a refugee is someone who's already crossed a border. So presumably they're safe for at least half a minute because they're not in their country of origin where they would face that persecution. Whether or not they're actually in a safe place is a different question. So for example, people might be in a refugee camp where there's different levels of services and safety. They might be in an urban setting where there's different levels of safety. It's a complicated question, and it is hard when you think about people who are, I don't know how, like a really bad analogy comes to mind, who are really like in the moment at risk for their lives. This is not an evacuation program, the US Refugee Admissions Program.
Thank you. We have Priscilla here. She says, some of the issues that my organization has encountered majority is the continuation of healthcare due to limited resources to all healthcare services, cancer screenings and screenings of that sort. What are some ways other organizations have overcome this disparity? So we're gonna hold on that question and to the end. And let me see if we have one more question. Yes, we have Giovanna asking, culture and religion are sometimes a challenge depending on the country they come from. How do you help them understand that in the US, male and female must be working towards self-sufficiency?
Excellent.
It's a bit of a cultural question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things to keep in mind. This is a good like little jump ahead and segue. It's hard. It's really hard. And one way to approach this is by having cultural humility, which we'll talk more about, which is it's different from cultural competency. It's understanding that people are the experts of their own lives, and we have to be open and ask questions of people as individuals to understand where they're coming from and what their beliefs are, both religious and cultural. And have conversations with them and really respect where they're coming from. And it is really challenging when people are coming from cultures where women don't work outside of the home, but they need to in order to have maybe a 2-income household, or often there might be women who are here, for example, without a partner, and they have to be able to work. So it's very complicated, and it's on a case-by-case basis, the way that you would approach that person. There's no one-size-fits-all approach for a lot of this stuff, because even people from the same country or from the same religion have extremely different experiences, even different reasons why they fit the refugee definition, maybe a different kind of persecution that they were facing. So it's really important to really focus in on the individual and use context from their country of origin and their culture and their religion, but also ask them, because you don't know how that applies to them. And that's the most important thing, is to really focus in on the individual and make it a conversation and a collaboration with that person. It's
right,
not
and I think, yeah, and I yes, and I think is a great bridge to continue what you're talking about with what it all means for service providers. So
great. So I want people to think about, and we don't actually have to talk about these questions, but I want people to think about as we go through this next portion, what does this mean for you all? What kinds of resilience, resources, and protective factors do you think refugee clients bring with them? Because there are many, many, many. And what challenges do you think they have? And if anybody has trouble thinking about what a resilient or protective factor it might be for a refugee, just think about the fact that they're here, that they left their country of origin somehow, they crossed a border, they applied to be resettled, they got on an airplane and they came here and they're doing it. They might be struggling now, but if you think about that, how many of us would never do that? You know, so there's always something that you can find to help. This is also like strengths-based perspective, to think about what resilience people have and what strengths they have, always as a starting point. And what challenges do you think they have? And we're going to talk about what some of those are, because of course there are many challenges that are very difficult for people to incorporate into their lives here. So the next slide is called Meet a Refugee in New Jersey. And we're not going to read these. There's a couple of articles and one video. And these are examples of some refugees who are living in New Jersey. And they just give an idea of the types of experiences of trauma, family separation, et cetera, that some people experience. This is by no means inclusive of all of refugees' experiences, but just to get a little bit of a sense of what people might have gone through. And the next slide talks about how people contribute and are hardworking, but there's also a traumatic past and people face challenges. So this slide, yeah, with Albert Einstein, that slide is also a reminder that refugees enrich our nation and our communities, and they really bring a lot to us. So also this is something to think about, you know, to use the term victim is problematic sometimes. Refugees have been through a lot, they've experienced a lot, but they also are extremely resilient and have a lot to offer. There'd be no Google if it weren't for refugees. There'd be no sriracha sauce, different kinds of music. And when you think about the food that we enjoy in our communities, many of them were brought there and businesses started by refugees. And here's an interesting fact. Refugees and immigrants are more entrepreneurial than people born in the United States. So they're starting businesses, creating jobs, bringing things into our communities. Okay, so here's really the meat of a lot of this presentation and some of the things that I think are going to help you in your work and the things that are important for you to keep in mind. The refugee experience can be very challenging, and I'm going to talk about it more broadly, but this does not apply to everybody, and there's a lot of nuance in what people experience. However, there are some trends that a lot of people do experience through this. And when I say refugee experience, I'm talking about refugees, asylees, and all of the other humanitarian statuses, people who end up here. Not everyone fits the refugee definition. They might have one of the other statuses, but even someone with one of the other statuses would fit the refugee definition. Even folks without one of those statuses, even immigrants with other kinds of visas may have gone through similar experiences to this. So it's important to keep in mind when you're working with anyone from somewhere else. So folks have different stages of migration. So there's a pre-flight when we think about what happened back home. So what did their persecution look like? Was there a lack of safety, fear, loss of jobs, livelihood, violence? Were they separated from family? Were they waiting in refugee camps, urban areas? Were their kids born in camps? How long have they been there? Limited healthcare access, limited employments. There's so many variety of conditions that people may have experienced in their country of origin under persecution. And then when they fled to their next place, when they crossed that border. So we talked before, but we don't know if that's safe or not. We don't know how long they're there or not. So there's a lot of different kinds of experiences people might have before they even get to the United States. So on this slide, there's the pre-flight, what happened there in their country of origin, the flight, the actual process of leaving their country of origin, the displacement, and that's where they ended up, that third country, so to speak, after they crossed a border. And during that time of, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. During that time of flight and transition, they might be afraid of being caught, returned. They might have left everything behind and not have their basic needs met. In that displacement period, they might be living in limbo. They might not have their basic needs met. And again, that could be a refugee camp or an urban area for refugees specifically. And then there's the resettlement piece. And resettlement is really hard. There's something called the triple trauma paradigm, which focuses in on the pre-flight, the persecution, and then the flight displacement piece, and then the resettlement piece, and how each one of those has a lot to it that can really impact a person's life. They can be traumatic. It can really impact who they are and the kinds of assistance that they need when they are resettled. Right, so somebody just put in so many major life transitions, right? And the time frame for that could be quite small or quite long. Next slide, please. So when we think about people who've made it to the United States, there's typically an experience that looks like this, where people get here and they finally feel safe. They're in the United States. They've been waiting for this. If they're a refugee and they've been waiting for a couple of years to be resettled, and they finally feel like they can take a breath and sigh a sigh of relief. But then often people go back into crisis because it's very hard here. The US isn't perfect. They miss their home country and culture. They have to get a job. They have to become employed. They have to support themselves. They have to get their kids in school. They have to learn English. All of these things, while also missing their family back home, missing comforting foods. They might feel sad, angry, hopeless, etc. And then after several more months, people might begin to see the good and bad of both countries, and then take some time to really integrate better and feel more balanced and adjusted to their life. This might be different for asylees. Asylees may have been here for a period of time before they got their asylee status, while they were stuck in sort of asylum seeker status. So this isn't a one size fits all, but you can imagine how people might feel really good to be safe, but then have reality sink in and have it take time for them to build up their lives and their needs in a way that they can feel adjusted and balanced. Next slide, please. So some things to really keep in mind with all of that is that life in a new country is often much harder than people imagined. Even if they didn't know what to expect in the United States, it still can be different and very, very hard. A lot of refugees say it's the hardest thing that they've ever gone through. And also, regardless of the kind of freedoms that people have here when they arrive, refugees leave behind everything familiar, their language often, their culture, friends, family. Some people are able to be resettled with their family. Some people are not. Some people are waiting for family reunification, and some people leave knowing that they're never going to see certain family members again. Next slide, please. So here are some other common experiences for newly arrived folks. I don't want to read through all of them, but you'll see just by a skim that things are really different, and that's the main thing. Every aspect of life can feel different, and some that are really important are really challenging to navigate. So when you think about the healthcare system, I still have a hard time navigating our healthcare system, and I've lived here my whole life. The more individualized focus on American society is difficult for folks to adjust to who come from a more community-centered culture. The quick pace of life in the United States, the initial need to support yourself is really challenging as well. So changes in family dynamics as well is another really important one, where people had a functioning family unit and then they're here and roles change. So maybe children learn English faster and then they are a conduit to the broader community before the parents are, and that can change family dynamics. Next slide, please. So it's also really important to think about how refugees and other humanitarian migrants are influenced by the broader systems in their life. So this is just a reminder, and I'm sure all of you in the social service and public health field are very familiar with this socio-ecological model where an individual rests within a community, within health systems, impacted by policy, the area that they live in, the country that they live in, and things like that. So just to make sure that you take a moment and think about these things when you're working with these kinds of individuals to help understand their circumstance and be able to help them as appropriately as possible. Next slide. So someone brought up mental health before, and I put this slide in here because it's so important and often overlooked by service providers who work with refugees every day, not because we don't know about it, but because time and funding and all of these things, but also for some other kinds of service providers who might not know that these are common experiences for refugees and other humanitarian migrants. People really do experience this list of common mental health and psychosocial concerns, as well as others. But I want to put this here and have you all take a look for a moment, because this can really impact people's ability to thrive, their ability to seek and gain and hold on to employment, medical care, all of these things. And many of them warrant clinical attention. Some might be helped by community support, maybe informal types of support. And me and my office, we work a lot on thinking about programs that would help people's mental health and social support needs that aren't a more traditional clinical mental health intervention. So what kinds of community support groups, what kinds of art could we be doing as a community? What kinds of things can we be doing to work on some of these concerns that isn't directly someone, if you think the other far end of the extreme, like a westernized version of therapy, for example, that there's things all along the spectrum that can support refugees and other humanitarian migrants with some of these things. And some definitely need clinical attention, and some might need a smaller intervention. Another thing I want to point out here is that 40% of refugees have experienced torture. And that extends, I'm sure, to other humanitarian migrant statuses as well. And that's something else to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about now are considerations for providers like you to keep in mind when you're working with this community. So one is lack of community support. Many refugees have smaller networks of support after they moved away from family or friends back home. They might only know some of their caseworkers at the agency that they're working with. A lot of folks might be weary to talk to other people from their home country because of the persecution they face back home, and because people fear their personal business might be shared within the community. This is really nuanced and can be very different. Oftentimes people are very happy to be connected with other folks from their home country, and oftentimes they really are not. So one example that I always like to share is I've worked with Eritrean refugees before, and they often don't want to be connected to other Eritreans who've been in the United States for a longer period of time, because they know an older version of Eritrea before certain modern persecutions were taking place. And the newer folks who've arrived don't feel comfortable because the people who've been here longer don't really understand what was going on and think that the new refugees are deserting their country, for example. So there's a lot of nuances. So it's important to check in with individuals about, do they want to be connected with other members of their community? Do they not? And support their decisions. Next slide, please. Childcare is a big one. A lot of folks don't have a community support system and don't know what to do with their children while accessing services. Even if childcare is offered through one of those service programs, they might not trust childcare. Another big one is fear of authority figures. Police and other uniformed folks, for example, might not be trusted in their home countries. It might bring back traumatic memories because maybe it was those authority figures that were persecuting them or were unable to protect those who were being persecuted. Unfamiliarity with the community. People might not know even just how to use basic public transportation or able to find an address that they're given. So like geographically, they might not know, as well as of course services that are around, they might not know. LGBTQI concerns are another thing to keep in mind. Certain folks might be especially hesitant to share this information. Same-sex relationships, for example, may be illegal where people come from, and that either may be why they faced violence or persecution, and why they have refugee status, or might be something in addition to their persecution claim that they've never told anyone and are worried about. So getting people the right kind of support can be important. Next slide, please. So language is a big one. Some refugees that don't speak English have trouble communicating. Even if agencies have interpretation services, it can be hard to get folks in the door. Phone calls are really hard if there's not interpretation at the beginning. Even getting someone literally through a door, if there's security measures, might be hard for someone who doesn't speak or read English. So just a lot of these things to think about, and I won't read through all of these. But using more basic terms can be helpful for folks who are still learning English. Talking about, for example, in the mental health setting, like symptoms rather than the names of things, which could be triggering. A lot of people hear the word depression or mental health or mental illness and shut down, but you might be able to say things like, do you feel sad? Do you cry? Use different words to talk around certain terms that might be triggering as well. Next slide. People might fear immigration repercussions. In the Trump administration, there was a public charge rule that was put in place that actually doesn't apply to refugees and humanitarian migrants, but people don't always know that, and they hear things through word of mouth, and it scares them. So utilizing services for some folks might result in inability to get status. So they're worried about different immigration repercussions for that, even though it doesn't, refugees and asylees are exempt from that. Also, refugees and asylees are not allowed to return to their home country without a special travel document obtained by the government until they're able to naturalize and become a citizen. The idea there is that if people are unsafe to live there, then they would be unsafe if they return. So there would have to be a good reason that's approved for someone to travel back home. So I mentioned that folks are eligible for naturalization after 5 years, but it's still hard to actually get it. It's not free. It's quite expensive actually for a lot of working folks. The test is very hard and actually got harder under the Trump administration. And it's particularly challenging for older people and non-native English speakers or folks who don't speak English at all. And waivers for those kinds of things are hard to get to help with that test. Next slide, please. So here's a slide all on cultural humility, which we talked about earlier. And this is a process rather than an end product. we often think about cultural competency as certain facts that you can learn, and then you feel more competent to serve folks from a certain place. And that only takes you so far. And some would say it's not a good practice, because you really need to look regardless at the individual. What is this individual experiencing? What is their personal family culture amidst a broader community culture? And it's the idea that you maintain an interpersonal stance towards another person, and you're open to them in relation to who they are and what their culture is. Another important thing here is that we all need to be aware of our own assumptions and values and understand that there are various worldviews, and we can't presume to know the background of a person, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, or what their views are. And we have to always take a step back and make sure that we allow people to be the experts of their own experience and to guide their needs and the kinds of programs and services that we provide for them. Next slide. Oh, you already did it. Client-centered communication is really important. Giving folks their own sense of agency and empowerment. An example of that could be when you're using an interpreter to still talk and look at the person who is the client, not the interpreter. I'm really making sure that people feel like you are centered on them and that it is them guiding the experience. You can also always involve a refugee agency, so that provider agency, if the client agrees and they have one, they're always happy to help. And I want to make a point here. Asylees don't automatically get linked up to one of these agencies. So refugees, they come from overseas, they're picked up from the airport. Asylees get status after they're already here. So many of them may not know that they're eligible for a lot of these services, and they may not already be connected to one of these providing agencies. So if you're in particular working with an asylee, ask them if they're connected with a provider agency and if they know that they might be eligible for cash assistance and employment services and other social support services. That's a role that you guys really have to play in knowing that asylees and some of these other folks with these other statuses are eligible, and make sure that they know that and get the appropriate referral to help them if they're not already connected. Next slide, please. So some additional best practices that I always encourage people to keep in mind is to be trauma informed. And there's a lot of trainings out there that you could find on this. I'll bet a lot of you already are trained in trauma informed servicing, but that you help establish a sense of safety and well-being is the main crux of being trauma informed, making sure that people feel safe where they are, because that's first and foremost for people to feel comfortable engaging in any services, is to feel safe from the outset. I mentioned being mindful of English language ability and knowing resources in the community. These are among the best practices. So the next slide shows how to connect with refugee agencies. There's a list of agencies that provide refugees those initial reception services. And a lot of those also provide the next 5 years worth of services that all of the folks are eligible for. And each state also has a state refugee coordinator that can help you identify what partners in the state are serving these clients. And then I have some resources that you all might be interested in listed out, which I know you'll see when you get the PowerPoint. So Joanna, if you want to put those up, you can. If not, but that's the end of my presentation. I know I went through a lot. Not all of it was in as much depth as maybe would be helpful because of the time that we have, but I'm happy to answer questions and point you in the direction of other resources if that would be helpful. And thank you.
Thank you so much. No, this was great. So before we open up for questions, we do have a little time. So I wanted to go ahead and show one of the videos showing how, how much refugees apport to our community, especially during the pandemic. I mean, this is not an exception. So I'm going to go ahead and share this very quickly.
In the future, somebody will help me. It's like a circle. I help somebody, somebody's help me. I came here to America with my family, my dad and my 3 brothers. My mom is passed away from 3 years. When the coronavirus came, IRC told me about this job. So when I heard about it, I say yes, I want it because you can help the people. You can work and don't feel like I'm a useless person. I can help. Hi, how many people? 4? You're welcome. Before coronavirus came, I was studying for GED and then everything is closed, so the exam is delayed. I want to get the GED because my dream is being architecture. I love drawing, and when coronavirus is gone, I want to make a gallery for my drawings. I think that coronavirus is just a period of time and it will be gone. So it's like a challenge to all the world. What gives me hope is my family. And I think if my mom is alive, she will be proud of me. I'm a refugee and I'm a food distributor.
This was great. So this is just one of the little examples of how much
Access
refugees.
limitless power with Elementor Pro. Design
Apologize.
every part of your blog with Elementor.
Okay, so yes, this is a little bit of an example of how much refugees have given to the country and continue to do. So we're gonna go open up for questions right now. You can still have a chance to send them on the chat or on the Q&A. And I'm gonna go ahead and start with a couple questions that we have. Do refugees choose where do they go? So asylum seekers do walk into the country that they want to seek protection from, but do refugees get that same opportunity to say like, no, I want to go to the United States or I want to go to Spain or something like that?
Right. That's a really excellent question. And usually no. Usually refugees are registered with the UN Refugee Agency, and that agency works with the countries around the world that have resettlement spots to place people in different areas. If there is a family connection, that can help influence that decision. And refugees actually don't even choose what state they're resettled to. So often if there's a family tie, they'll be resettled to that state and hopefully that community so that they're together. But a lot of folks don't even get to choose once they are coming to the United States what state that they're resettled into. However, once they arrive, there are no restrictions to where they can live. So anyone can decide to move to a different place.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about COVID and healthcare system. So one of the things that you mentioned was that there could be a fear of the health system, or even is so different than their own countries that is so hard to understand. Do you know where refugees in general stand when it comes to COVID cases and vaccinations or anything like that? It might not be your area, but we're curious about COVID and refugees.
Yeah, I don't have all of that information because it really varies. The way it varies in American-born populations as well. What's your education level? What's your cultural background? What access do you have to information? I think that there's still a lot of need for education around the needs of the need of vaccination and what it does for folks. And there are a lot of programs out there geared towards that for refugees and other immigrant populations. And one of the resources I have is for something called NRC RIM. And that's something that was started by the IRC and like the Minnesota something. And it's a really great website that has resources on all of those things, how to talk to refugees about COVID, about staying safe, about the vaccine. And they've been doing a lot of work on understanding vaccine hesitancy in the refugee population and other migrants to be able to provide more targeted information that's appropriate, that's culturally appropriate, that resonates with folks about COVID safety and COVID vaccines. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that if you're interested in more of those bits of information.
Thank you. And that's great. And just so everybody know, you will be getting a copy of this PowerPoint with all the links so you can see the resources shared today, as well as a copy of the recording, and you'll be sent an evaluation that we ask you to please complete so we can get some feedback on this webinar. moving on to the next question. Andrea is asking, when individuals are granted this status, does your agency pay for the initial housing issues? And what are the agencies that assist with these services until they are eligible for other social services?
So it's a great question, and it varies a little bit. For refugees who come through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, they're given a one-time grant, and the amount varies per number of family members, and that grant goes towards securing their housing and security deposit and first few months rent. Different agencies might have different resources that can help extend the amount of time that their rent is covered. But refugees are the only ones that really have that grant money as part of the program. For other folks, for the asylees and other folks who are getting different kinds of cash assistance, that's part of the services that they get, but it's not enough to actually pay rent. So refugees are the only ones who really get like an apartment figured out for them, and then the initial months funded.
Great. And Andrew's also asking about what if an individual refuses the services from IRC? And I wanted to add to that question, can they refuse the help once they get here? Or how long do they have to stay with an agency in order to, follow up with the rules of coming to the US as a refugee?
Those are great questions. There's not a lot that people are required to do. So when refugees come, they're required to have a health screening, and there's certain services that the agency is required to provide. But if a refugee never shows up, what can the agency do? So nothing's really being imposed on them. Most refugees really want these services and need these services. For other folks like asylees and other folks who may have been here for some time and have one of the other statuses, it's, I think, easier for them to pick and choose what they need based on what they're eligible for in collaboration with one of the agencies that provides these services. So there's maybe not like, here's this whole framework of services, here are them all, which often refugees really need. But for other folks, maybe they take one from here based on their needs and their eligibility. And there was a question I missed, I think, about what services do people get before they're eligible for these? And that's a really good question. So I'm talking about services that are provided to people who are eligible for Office of Refugee Resettlement funding. And it's this big suite of services. So for asylum seekers, they're not eligible for these things. And you'd have to look a little bit elsewhere for what kinds of community resources are being provided, because typically, federally funded programs are not something that they can access. It really depends, and I'm not an expert in those, but it's not as much as people who have these statuses.
Great. One more question. How many spots does each country have? Can you talk a little bit about that? Is it 100,000 divided in specific countries, or is that like, how does it work, the numbers and the countries or the regions?
Every country makes their own decision about refugee arrivals, and I'm not up to date on what those global numbers are, but the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, which stands for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, but we always just call it the UN Refugee Agency, they work with all of the countries, and they always have like a yearly needs assessment of the number of folks who need resettlement and talk to the countries about how many slots they're willing to provide. So you could find that information through the UN Refugee Agency. For the United States, we determine our number essentially by the president in consultation with Congress. It hasn't looked quite as normal in the last handful of years, that process, as it should have, and the numbers were quite low. We had a historic low in the last few years in terms of the number of refugees that the US said it would admit, and now the Biden administration is bringing that number back up. So there's a lot of political will behind the number that the United States chooses. It's complicated and political and depends on the needs and trends around the world and the humanitarian interests of the United States and political interests of the United States. But it's essentially determined by the president, quote, in collaboration with Congress.
Great. And a follow-up question, what about within those numbers that we are allowed? Is there a gap on regions, like 20% have to be from South America, 30% have to be from, I don't know, Africa? Is there something like that? There
are regional allocations within that. There's usually a set number for different regions, and then like another category to help be nimble to the needs of folks and also to who's in the refugee pipeline. again, it gets a little complicated because you saw that chart with all of those convoluted steps. It's a really long process, so we don't always know who's going to be ready to get on an airplane, and that can also impact who's able to actually come and those caps.
Great, and I think it's so important that people understand the long process, because people are afraid of, any red flags. And for what I know, and you can confirm this, Trina, that if there is any red flag throughout the whole process, the people are not allowed to come here. So it's a very long and a very, very hard process for them to be vetted and then get here. So any, orange flag, it's a red flag. So it's pretty safe in a way, right?
It is. There have been reports done that show like your risk of being harmed by someone who came in through the refugee program is much less than your chance of being hit by lightning 5 times, for example.
Wow.
So it's basically zero in terms of what we've seen.
Yes, thank you. And I guess one question is what everybody, is hearing right now. There's so many questions about what's happening in Afghanistan without getting into the politics and the military and all of that. But with, the refugees coming, a lot of people have seen those pictures of a lot of people in planes. Those people, as far as you know, because I don't know if we even know yet, are they still going to go through the same vetting process that takes years? What can you tell us about what's going on with the refugee crisis in Afghanistan right now?
I'm less familiar with what's happening literally right now because it's all unfolding as we speak. The Special Immigrant Visa Recipient Program has been around for a long time, and that has a certain criteria. So only certain people are eligible for that program. And then they're provided a visa after they apply and are vetted through that program. So we've seen in the last couple of months, evacuations of people from Afghanistan who are eligible for that status, and they're brought to the United States, and then they're housed here to undergo the processing and the checks for that before they're sort of released and able to live in and access additional services. We're going to see probably an increase in the number of Afghan folks who come through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and there's going to be some changes in terms of a certain type of refugee processing that they can get. Often there's something called P2 that allows additional access for folks from a certain country undergoing who've experienced a certain kind of persecution. So we'll see what happens, but there's also a lot of advocacy right now to make sure that we're able to protect as many Afghans as possible through all of these means, including, and this is not, these folks aren't eligible for our services, but there's also something called temporary protective status, which the president can determine, which means that folks from a certain country who are already in the United States can stay here for, it's usually 2 years at a time, the status applies, where they don't have to go home, if that makes sense.
Great. Yes. And I just wanted to highlight that what you mentioned earlier, that the people that qualify for these visas are normally people that work directly with the US military to help them, such as translators, interpreters, and things like that. So there's people that have a relationship already with the US military that qualify for these visas, not necessarily refugees. Correct?
That's right.
All right, so we have a couple more questions. Are people who seek asylum the ones that cannot ever return to their home country?
So I'm not sure for those seeking asylum, if they've already applied for asylum and have not yet received asylee status, I'm not sure. I would guess it would not work in their favor to go home during that time. And then once someone has asylee status or refugee status, they can't go home unless they have that travel waiver document that's approved by the government. Once people become citizens, they can leave the United States and go home, and they can travel around the world and come back like any other US citizen. But when they only have that other status, it's harder for them, and they need special permission to go back to their country of origin and be able to get back into the United States.
But could they travel to other countries?
Yes.
Like, without issues? Okay.
Yes.
Couple more questions. What can CBOs and other community leaders do to help build the capacity of refugee and asylum communities? Are there programs that show promise, for example, community health workers?
What a great question. Thank you for that. Yes to all of those questions. There have been a lot of programs that these anchor agencies provide that have been developed, especially over the last couple of years, like community health worker programs, where you take someone from the community and train them to provide health information to clients. I would say that a good starting point is to get some information about the refugee and asylee community where you are, to talk to some of these anchor agencies, see what kinds of needs they have, see if they could maybe do a specialized training for you on the populations that live where you are. For example, we're thinking, we're in the process of planning a training for a regional medical center to talk about refugees in that county and the specific needs that they have, and provide some mental health training on how to best work with refugee clients who come from certain places, who have certain backgrounds, who have those needs. So really, like, communicating with these agencies and understanding what populations they're serving and how your agencies can serve them and fill in some of those service gaps, and also serve them better by having a better understanding of who they are, what statuses they have, what are they eligible for, things like that. There's a lot of room to help build that capacity. And now is the time to be doing that, because we're gonna see more arrivals, because the refugee goal has increased with the Biden administration. They've set the number higher for this fiscal year and next fiscal year than we saw during the Trump administration. And as the back end of things picks back up, we're gonna actually see increased numbers, and we're gonna see increase in numbers of special immigrant visa recipients from Afghanistan this year. So it's stormy now, but it's like the calm before the stormier busy time. So definitely now is a good time to be thinking about these things and asking yourself and asking other people these questions.
Right. And going back to Priscilla's question from earlier on, she says some of the issues that my organization has encountered majorly is the continuation of healthcare due to limited resources to all healthcare services, such as cancer screenings and screenings of that sort. What are some ways other organizations have overcome these disparities that you know of?
That's a really good question. And different communities have tried different things. Some agencies have worked on making like medical accompaniment programs to help folks partner with medical students to help them navigate the medical system and get some of that additional support. Some folks have done fundraising to provide additional case management for health needs. It is complicated, and it depends on what medical insurance do people have, if they don't have it, if they aren't eligible anymore, what kinds of services are available in the state. A lot of that is really specific to the circumstances of a community and a state and what's going on there. But people have, I could probably find more information on some best practices. And it's all like, are we talking cancer screenings or other kinds of things? But really bringing in community members also who maybe have been here for a longer period of time, who are medical providers in their country of origin, to work with members of their own community. That's been a really good best practice that we've seen. I mean, those are trusted messengers and trusted folks in a lot of cases to provide that information and help make some of those connections. Sometimes it comes down to like charity care at hospitals and services, or finding clinics that are free or have a sliding scale for folks if they no longer have insurance. I wish there was a better answer to get everyone's needs met.
I love what you mentioned about using people that were, healthcare or medical professions in their country, because it's so important for us to understand that not speaking English and being an immigrant does not mean that you don't have a profession and you're not educated in your own country, especially when it comes to refugees that they come from this trauma. I mean, they could have been lawyers, they could be teachers, doctors, all of these things, and then when they get here, none of that is valid. So it's so important to acknowledge that, because I think it adds a little bit to their trauma of starting from zero. So it's so important.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that there are programs that help people achieve what they want to professionally. So oftentimes it takes a long time, let's say for a doctor to recertify here, a long time, but to help them find work in the meantime that at least is related to what they're doing. And there's some financial coaching programs, some career pathways programs that help people when they're already working continue up that ladder more towards what they're actually qualified for or where they want to be if they don't already have those certifications. But it's perhaps unnecessarily hard in this country for professionals from other countries to do their work here and go through all of those hoops to become recertified.
Yeah, and that could be a great service that organizations can offer, is help people work with their equivalency of degrees. so they can do something at least similar to what they chose to do in their countries. I know, I don't think the US has done this, but I know during the pandemic in Spain, for example, they allowed an exception to people that were doctors and nurses in their home country to practice during the pandemic because they had such a shortage of professionals and they had so many people in the hospital. So they allowed that exception.
The state of New Jersey did that too, actually, for certain kinds of professionals. Right? Sorry?
I think they did it with retired nurses and retired doctors, but not abroad. Or do they do also for abroad people?
No, I think they allowed people with foreign credentials a certain level of ability to work.
That's great.
I'm pretty sure. I'd have to go back and like actually look up what Governor Murphy said and all of that, because that was a while back that started. But yes, they did things like that too here.
Great. Yeah. So I think we have our last question. If anybody has any more questions, please put it on the chat. But we have here Maria that's asking, no, Michelle, sorry. How to help a refugee who doesn't know to speak English and he is here more than 5 years to keep his SSI benefits?
So that's a complicated question. SSI benefits max out after 7 years if you are not a citizen. So it's important that that person naturalize, and there are waivers. I'm not up to date on what the waivers are. You'd have to look into that. There are waivers for certain people based on age primarily or medical disability that can help waive the civics test, for example. And that would be one way to help them. They unfortunately, they have to naturalize. There's been a lot of advocacy over the years to change that for humanitarian migrants and refugees to not have that 7-year cap on SSI benefits, but that has never successfully been changed. So bottom line is they have to become a citizen by the time they hit that 7-year mark.
So they don't have a residency, a green card status in between?
They do, but supplemental security, I'm getting the acronym wrong. It always, I'm like a new mom, like my brain is a little bit Swiss cheese. Even if you have your green card, the maximum number of years that you can receive SSI benefits is 7 for any non-citizen. So somebody has to naturalize if they want to receive SSI benefits beyond 7 years.
Great. Thank you. And I don't think we have any more questions, so we're going to move ahead. Thank you so much, Hina. This has been a great presentation. Again, we are going to be sharing with all of you the PowerPoint so you can get access to all the links and resources, as well as the recording so you can share with your coworkers or anybody that you think might benefit from learning from this, and as well as a link to the evaluation that we please ask you to complete so we can get some feedback on not only the webinar and on Shayna, but also on upcoming ideas and webinars. So we want to thank you so much for everybody for coming. And if you have any questions, here are some of the resources. If you have any questions, you can always contact us at cebasolutions@proceedinc.com. Shay is going to put our email on the chat, so we can definitely forward you anything else. So thank you so much, everybody, and we will see you again on our next webinar. And Shayna, any last words?
Just thank you all so much for your interest. This population has a lot of needs and brings a lot to our community. So when we help them, they have a lot more to contribute. And I'm really glad that you're all here showing interest in helping out this community. Thank you so much.
And I love what you said, that they are the biggest entrepreneurs. So that's great. It's a great thing for our economy. It's a great thing for our communities. So it's awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. And we will see you again on our next webinar. Thank you, Shayna, for joining us.
Take care, everybody.